Good morning. My goodness me, there are a huge number of very clever people here this week, aren't there? Yeah, I'm not one of them. I need to warn you before we start, just in case you want to leave and go and have a cup of coffee while I'm speaking. I'm afraid I don't have any detailed research or data to share with you today. Sorry. And I don't have a lot of very intelligent things to say. What I want to do in the hour that I am lucky enough to have with you is share just some personal feelings around change, the nature of change, and most importantly, the link between change, the world we're living in, and education. I hope that's okay with you. I've been fascinated by change, really, I think, since I was a young teacher, because I moved into a world in education, in a primary school, surrounded by the most extraordinary people. People who were curious, creative, innovative, who were hungry for experiences, who weren't scared of failure, who just woke up every morning thinking, I can't wait to change today. The kinds of people we wish we were. The kinds of people that companies all over the world would pay huge salaries to have on their teams. The problem is, these people were under 5 years old. So, the fascination, I guess, for me has come from one singular question, which is what happens to us? Where does it go? Why do we end up at events where we have to learn how to think again? Right now, this to me is a fascinating concept. And for years, I've tried to get to grips with this concept. I recently was reading up on the work of a very famous traditional educational thinker, a man called E.D. Hirsch. Have many of you heard of E.D. Hirsch? He was the American educator that created the phrase, knowledge is power. When you look at the way that most developed education systems are continuing to develop their curricula, Spain, the UK, the US, most of the political policymakers' thinking is based on the work of E.D. Hirsch. That children must have a bank of set knowledge if they are ever to succeed in life. Now, to an extent, I understand what Hirsch is saying. I understand that for people to interact with the world, for people to process the complexity of the world around them, young people need to have a richness of experiences and understandings. I don't think anyone on earth would deny that. And the more experiences we have, and the more things we understand, the more we're capable of processing new things. However, the point at which this kind of theory troubles me is when, and I heard Hirsch say this in an interview in 2013, you get into the conversation about what is knowledge, what is core knowledge. Is there a bank of knowledge that all children must have? And his answer is yes. There has been a traditional set of knowledge, a core knowledge, that has always been important. And his argument for that is this: because core knowledge, through history, doesn't change very fast. I would argue that to an extent he was probably right up until about 20 years ago. And if anyone can honestly tell me that the world's bank of knowledge and information hasn't changed much in the last 20 years, I'd ask them whether they'd been in a coma. How many of you have got children of your own? I know Jeff asked this a minute ago. Just put your hands up for me. I'm not going to ask you to do anything. How many got children? Keep your hands in the air if you have teenage children. I'm so sorry. What can I say? I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Jeff, really, I feel your pain. I have two children who are both teenagers at home. It's why I spend my life in Bilbao and traveling. I'm not going to tell you about my older child. She's just left and gone to university. I want to tell you about why I think, more than ever, this thing around change is so dramatic now. I had an experience with my 15-year-old son recently. And this, for me, challenged every concept I have about childhood education and technology. The three things that in many ways we've come together here to talk about this morning. Right? So, my 15-year-old son is a normal teenage boy. He's not particularly brilliant. He smells like teenage boys do. His bedroom is like a toxic waste dump. I am sure, actually, that he is personally responsible for global warming. And what's interesting about the maturation and development of teenage boys is the smell changes. I need to talk to you scientifically about this. I don't care, frankly, if you get nothing out of this morning. This is just therapy for me. So the smell goes from being kind of rotting flesh. And then boys discover girls. And the smell changes to deodorant. My son believes that he needs to use an entire can of deodorant every day. So, his room is not a good place to be, right? Which means, and by the way, my wife and I, we're terrible parents, okay? We let our children do all the things that will apparently turn them into serial killers. You need to know this of me. Because my son has in his bedroom an Xbox. And when he comes home to school, after a hard day's learning, he likes to go to his bedroom and chill out on his Xbox. Now, the thing with him is he puts on headphones and a microphone. So when it comes to tea time, my wife and I can't shout up the stairs, "Andrew! Food!" Nothing. Can't hear us. So my wife and I now have to go up to his bedroom and go into his bedroom and ask him to come down for tea. Now, because of the toxic danger of my son's bedroom, we both believe that too much exposure would kill us. So we take it in turns. And one particular night was my night. So I go up to my son's bedroom and knock on the door. Nothing. I walk into his bedroom and he's sat there on his Xbox with his back to me. So he can't see me come in. And he's playing on his Xbox. And luckily, he's playing FIFA on his Xbox. The football game, right? And you know how when you have a new experience, it takes you a minute to kind of focus in on the surroundings you're in. And I could see what he was doing, but it took me a little bit longer to hear what was happening. Because Andrew was talking, obviously, to somebody on the other end of his microphone, somewhere else in the world. But here's the remarkable thing. Andrew was talking in Russian. Now, there are some things you need to understand about my family situation. The first thing you need to know, which is obvious, is I'm English. This means we don't speak any other languages in my house. The second thing you need to know about Andrew is he is learning Spanish and German at school. He has been learning Spanish and German at school for 4 years. The problem is, and by the way, he's an A-grade student in Spanish and German, he can't speak a word. Because he's learning those subjects to take an exam, not to actually use the skills. So, there is no obvious way in which my son has learnt to speak what is pretty much fluent Russian. So I wait for him to come off his game, and he turns round, and he notices that I'm in the room. And I'm in a complete mess. So I'm stood there saying, ha, 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 wah, woo. See, I don't even speak English. Woo. He luckily translates dad language, and he said, yes, I was speaking Russian, whatever. So I'm talking now, I'm going, how did you? And he did this thing, you know, that teenage boys do. Duh. He said, I've got a friend, Sergey. Sergey lives in Moscow. I met Sergey online a year ago. We started playing FIFA together. He said when we started out, he said we decided to teach each other some phrases in our own language. At this point, he went a little bit red. Because he said, to be honest, Dad, we started by teaching each other how to swear in our own languages. This is not a surprise to me. He said, but we learned how to swear in each other's languages pretty quickly. He said, so then we moved on. He said it wasn't deliberate, but we just started learning each other's way of speaking. And a year on, he speaks Russian almost fluently. Now, I'd like E.D. Hirsch to meet my son for a number of reasons. He didn't need a teacher to teach him Russian. In fact, he's learnt Russian in his own way faster than any teacher has taught him to speak Spanish or German. Why? Because it matters to him. Why? Because he's in control of the learning. How? Because he's collaborating with somebody who is an expert Russian speaker in Russia. This, I think, presents a huge challenge to us as educators, as schools, as leaders of children. Because whatever anybody says, the world has definitely changed. Now, the thing with change is that it's not new. It's not a phenomenon of the 21st century. How on earth would we have gone from cave dwellers to where we are now if change was a recent invention? But the point about this for me, and the reason why this conference is so incredibly important, is because I think humanity has reached a tipping point. Because I think that tipping point is this: change is exponential. The more we change, the faster change becomes. The birth of digital technology was like giving drugs to an athlete. It accelerated the process even faster. And the challenge and the tipping point I think we've reached now is this one. I think we're now in a point in human history where the rate of change is quicker than the ability of most people to comprehend it. Now, this is dangerous. This is dangerous for people's mental state. And again, Jeff referred to this in his brilliant keynote just now. And it's dangerous because our education system is predicated on the E.D. Hirsch version, which is things change slowly. That, for me, is where the challenge comes. We're not talking about traditional curriculum versus progressive curriculum. We're talking about an education system that has to be fit for purpose. And whilst I totally understand that viewpoint, I'm afraid it is no longer the truth. And so we have to change. We have to think deeper. We have to think deeper about ourselves. We have to think deeper about our mental state. We have to be far more emotionally intelligent. And we have to understand that, in my opinion, we have to stop believing that we just throw systems and structures at the problem. You see, for me, systems and structures change nothing. People do. Think about your own setting and how many new ideas you've heard and been seduced by. How many new ideas in education have appeared to you to be incredibly sexy? And you've gone away and you've thought, that must be the answer then. Let's do that in our school. Let's do that in our college. Because somebody has come along and said, do this, and the world will be okay. And how many of those great ideas are now living in the cupboard full of great ideas that every school and college in the world has? That room that you open and all these ideas fall out. Oh, I remember that one. Oh, that one was good. That one lasted 6 weeks. One of the great challenges for businesses right now, as I get the chance to work increasingly with major corporations, is their entire mental attitude is based on get the people at the top to design the system, implement it to the people lower down, and that's what we do. Because, of course, what education in its traditional sense builds is almost, arguably, a dependency culture. We are almost taught from an early age to wait and be told what to do and how to do it, and then be praised when we've implemented somebody else's idea really well. In a way, that's the tipping point. That's the moment that our incredible children under 5 stop progressing at the rate they progress. Because up until that point, they've been in control of learning. What happens then is we say, all the things you're interested in, not important right now. What's going to happen from here on in for the next few years is we're going to tell you what matters. And by the way, the reason it matters is pretty abstract, isn't it? You turn round to a 5-year-old child and you say, no, trust me, I know best. Why? Because I do. Why? Because if you work really hard, and we'll test you on how hard you're working, yes, you'll get really clever. And what happens if I become really clever? If you become really clever, you get to go to a good school. And what happens if I go to a good school? You'll pass lots of exams. What are exams? Don't worry about that. You'll love them. And if I study really hard and pass all those lots of exams, what happens to me, oh great wise one? What happens is you might get into university. University? And what happens at university? Well, at university, you get to study really hard. Why? To take more exams. To a 5-year-old, this is not a clever concept, right? So this is the point at which this happens, this moment where we park it. We park our natural curiosity, our excitement for the world, our power of learning, our ability to develop, our ability to trust thinking for ourselves. You see, one of the things for me about an event like today is actually the underlining theme that keeps coming through is trust yourself. Trust your instincts. Trust what happens in here and in here. And isn't that ironic? Because you don't see a 2-year-old child in therapy because they don't know how to think for themselves. You don't meet a 2-year-old child that is under a psychiatrist because they can't cope with the rate of change in their lives. In fact, most 2-year-olds go mad if they don't have change in their lives. So this becomes an interesting challenge for me. So we've got to stop believing that somebody else is going to come along with the answer. That somebody is suddenly going to walk into a room one day and give us permission to change the way we work. The truth is, and the critical question for me about a conference like this, is when you leave here tomorrow evening, what are you going to do differently? Not who are you going to wait for next time? What are you going to do differently? Because the truth is, the ultimate trust has to come from our belief in ourselves, running and leading the education system. No one is ever going to tell us we have that right. We have to just act on it, right? So whatever happens, that's the promise I want you to be creating over what's left of this extraordinary event. What are you going to do about it once this event is over? How are we going to take control of education together? How are we going to overcome the biggest disease of the 21st century? Again, it's interesting. Jeff referred to this in his keynote address. This troubles me because I see this as the greatest disease of the 21st century. Again, it's not new, but what the data tells us is there are more people today on earth suffering from severe mental health problems than at any time in human history. And that's not just because of population explosion, that's by ratio. And what's really scary is the dramatic rise in youth mental health problems amongst young people. Oxford and Cambridge universities in the last 10 years have had to quadruple the number of psychiatrists working with students in order to help our most academically kids overcome the mass anxiety they have. Why? Because partly for me again, the causes of stress come most from when you perceive you have no control over your own life anymore. If you think about the stress levels in yourself and when they rise most dramatically, they rise at that moment where you suddenly think, I'm not in control of this. Educators increasingly feel stressed because they feel somebody else controls their entire agenda. Most people today feel incredibly stressed because despite doing everything they were told as they grew up, the world they were told they would be moving into that would be safe and stable, jobs for life, homes, all the stuff we were promised, doesn't exist now. You know, none of us have a problem with change when we choose to control it. So, for example, if you've been going on holiday to the same location for a few years and you suddenly decide to go somewhere different, you're excited because you made that decision. So the issue for me here is really centered on this feeling of a lack of control. Now, do we continue to run an education system which teaches children to be controlled by others? Or do we reframe the education system to make sure our children feel that it's a celebration of self-belief, self-leadership, and self-control? This to me isn't kind of some liberal left agenda. This to me is about the future health of the global people. So let me take this on another stage, and I'll read the next slide to you. What's on the next slide are 5 of the early warning signs of stress-related illness. I'm not going to dwell on it, but when I put these things up, because there are experts far greater than me at this convention and in this room, but these things really resonated with me. And as I show you these things, I want you to think about them through 3 lenses. I want you to think honestly about yourself and how many of these symptoms you recognize in yourself. I want you to think about your colleagues, and I want you to think about how many of these symptoms you recognize in your colleagues. And finally, for those of you privileged enough to be teachers, I want you to think very seriously about these 5 behaviors in relation to the students you are lucky enough to teach. I'll just give you 30 seconds, less maybe, for this period of reflection. I'll read them out and just go quiet for a second, right? Here they are. So, 1, demonstration of an anxiety or apprehension when something new is suggested. 2, tension and rigidity in new and novel situations, things you're not used to. A tendency to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol. And let me just clarify this. By drugs, I'm not talking about illegal substances. I'm talking about self-prescribed medicines you get from the pharmacy. 4, a tendency to complain during a new experience or activity. And finally, you tend to focus on the negatives of a new situation rather than the positives. I wonder how many people recognize that one. Something new happens, or even something new is suggested. How often does this happen in a staff room? Something new is suggested and everybody says, oh, we'd love to do that, but. Right? This isn't weakness. This isn't people being difficult. This is an early warning sign that people feel a lack of control. So, of course, one of the great challenges of leadership and educational leadership and corporate leadership is, as Jeff spoke about far more expertly than I can, the key is the transference of control. That doesn't mean you stop leading. It means leadership is seen through a totally different lens. But actually, the art of great leadership has always been to empower the people who work with you and for you. That's the art of a great leader. Anyone can scare people into doing stuff. That's not great leadership, that's bribery. Great leadership is that unbelievable ability to empower other people so they want to come on the journey that you're leading. And in a way, that's the art form of a great teacher, isn't it? It's not a secret. We don't need experts to tell us that. That's what great teaching and teachers have always done. We inspire our students to lead themselves on a journey that is of value. That, to me, is what we need. So we need to start to think differently. And at this point, I want to start telling you about a few of my famous friends. Now, I want to do this for no other reason than I want you to realize how clever and important I am because of the people I hang out with, okay? There is no real reason for this. The first one I want to tell you about is probably the coolest person I know. And what I've discovered as I've got older and fatter and balder is that I want to hang out with young and cool and groovy people. So after my speech, if you want to come and meet me, if you look like me, I'm not interested. Okay? I only want to meet the young, cool, groovy people. It makes me feel better. So let me tell you about the first friend I've made recently to help me cure this problem I have. His name, you wouldn't recognize him, his name is Sebastian Foucault. Now, Sebastian, his name might not mean anything to you, but when I tell you that Sebastian was the founder of parkour, or free running, you start to realize who I'm talking about. And you can see now why I hang out with him. He's cool and groovy, okay? And he's not that young, but younger than me, but he's cool and groovy, so it's fine. Now, the thing about Sebastian, just so that more of you can know who he is, I wonder how many of you remember seeing the James Bond film, Casino Royale, with Daniel Craig. It was his first film as James Bond. And I can see some people in the audience going, oh yes, ooh. He's not all that, really, trust me, he isn't. I said that to my wife when she was sat there in the cinema going, ooh, yes, shush, right? So, if you remember the opening sequence of that film, Daniel Craig, Bond, is chasing a bad guy over buildings and cranes. It's a really powerful beginning to a movie. Well, the bad guy is Sebastian, right? Couple of things just for you to know, just to put in the mix so you can know Sebastian like I do. First of all, that sequence used no safety equipment. That was done for real. Took 2.5 weeks to plan, but there was no safety ropes involved at all. That was done as shot. The more impressive thing to know about Sebastian is when you think about that and parkour and leaping over buildings, he is scared of heights. Work that one out. Now, the interesting thing for me is trying to understand where Seb is in here. So one day we're walking through a Russian city called Ekaterinburg together. And Ekaterinburg is one of those amazing Russian cities where you can see the history of the architecture through the buildings. You can see the history, the arc of history for the city. So you've got this incredible opulent architecture, which is pre-communism. And then you've got the kind of very concrete functional architecture of communism. And now you've got this explosion in a new self-expression, a new creativity, a new confidence in the most stunning modern architecture, similar actually to some of the incredible architecture here in Bilbao. And we're walking through the streets together, and I'm like a child at a firework party. I love buildings. So as I'm looking at the buildings, I'm going, oh, look at. Anyway, we get to the end of our journey, and I turn round to Sebastian. And I said, aren't the buildings incredible? And he looked at me like I was talking a different language, which I was because he's French. But as I said earlier, I speak English French. So I turned round to him again and I said, look at the buildings. Aren't they incredible? And he said, no, I still don't understand. I said, really? He said, Richard, you need to know something. He said, ever since I was a child, buildings have never excited me. He said, I grew up in a very socially deprived community on the outskirts of Paris. He said, where there were tower blocks everywhere. He said, and I remember as a little child, and we all remember that. You know that time where you remember things being bigger than they are when you return as an adult. And because you're small, everything's like huge. And he said, I used to look at my surroundings, and buildings to me were evil because they blocked out the light. He said they were objects that got in the way of the light. They felt like a prison. Isn't that amazing? Isn't it incredible? When we think about the kids in our most socially deprived communities, it's got nothing to do with them being stupid. It's got nothing to... They actually see the world in a way that we could learn from. So don't you think, rather than saying, actually your experiences are bad, so we're just going to teach you the right stuff in life, sometimes what we could learn from those students and the way they see the world is truly earth-shattering. Because Seb would have been in somebody's class. So Seb said, I looked at, he said, and it was the time at which, as a young child, my fascination began with the spaces. And then he looked at me in the way that only a poetic Frenchman can. And he said, have you ever looked at the spaces between buildings? He said they're beautiful. They are the most beautiful things on earth. The shapes between the objects. He said, so when I was walking through the city with you just now, I was thinking to myself, how do I use the spaces to get around the objects, over the objects, under the objects? How do I escape the objects by using that beautiful shaft of light? The interesting thing for me as he was speaking is this. Isn't that more how we should be teaching our children to see the world? Because I wonder whether what we actually do is we teach them just to see the objects. So that when we grow up and we talk about change and the ability to move, the response is always but. But there's a building in the way. And the building in education could be the government, it could be policy, could be curriculum, could be university entrance requirements, could be exams, could be the inspectorate. The thing is, we're all very good at looking at the buildings. Have you noticed this? Maybe what we need to be doing is saying, how do we shift our mindset so that we teach our children, and if we can ourselves, to look for the beauty of the space between the buildings and between the objects? Wouldn't that be great? So when you're next planning lessons to take to your students, when you're next thinking about leading or managing people, what you're doing is what Jeff was talking about. And the thing about stance for me is saying, okay, how do we move to the spaces? What are the objects that are going to be in the way here? How do we see the gaps? How do we see the spaces? Teaching our children always to look for the spaces and not be punished when they can't see the way through a building. Because what then happens is children stop looking for the spaces. They just look for the buildings they feel comfortable in. That's the point at which the whole thing around risk diminishes for us. Here's what I mean. Have a look at that picture. Isn't it gorgeous? Isn't it beautiful? Isn't that aesthetically magnificent? What does that scream to you? That screams freedom, doesn't it, to you? Isn't it beautiful? And if I asked you, what age you think the person was who drew that picture? And it's not a trick question. My guess is most of you would not say somebody over 50 or under 40 or under 30 or 20 or 10. Most of you would probably guess at under 5, and you'd be right. This is a toddler who drew this picture. We've all had them when we've come home from work, haven't we? You're exhausted at the end of the day and your little darling can't wait to meet you at the front door because they've been drawing at the kitchen table. Actually, most of them have been drawing on the kitchen table. And they bring you this piece of paper, which is the only bit that made it onto the piece of paper. And they come to the front door excited as you come through the door tired. And they say, "Daddy, look what I did." And you do the things that all good parents do. You say, "Oh, darling, that's beautiful. No, really, And then we have a thing in our house. Is it good enough for the fridge gallery? Yes. Everything up till now's fine. Until we ask the next question. The next question is the killer, and you already know what it is. It's lovely, darling. What is it? First point in our lives where we start to realize that somebody else will tell us whether it's right or wrong or of value. It's the first point in our lives where we realize things can't be of value just because they are. Because you have to have somebody else's quantifier built onto that. And that, to an extent, I believe, changes everything. Let's take it on a step. Isn't that a beautiful image? That's taken from a book that I believe every human being should have access to. It's a book called Earth from the Air. It's filled with pictures like that. I often use this in seminars with business groups. And it's a simple exercise because I'll turn round to them and I'll say, "What is that picture?" The interesting thing is, when you ask most adults in business groups what that picture is, they will immediately start to look for the correct answer. Because we've been trained to find the correct answer. So what they'll say to you is, because this is what's going through their heads, right? The process in people's minds. Blue water, brown land, green, could be pollution, could be algae. Hold on, I think it's sulfurous. I definitely think it's sulfurous because that looks like the residue of a larval flow. Oh, and there's a hot spring. I think this is somewhere volcanic. And then what happens is we see the walkway. And we think, that's interesting. If this is a volcano, how can there be a walkway? And then if you're close enough to see, which I'm afraid most of you aren't, the people on the bridge are wearing shorts and t-shirts. So then the process says to you, this is somewhere safe. This is a tourist destination. This is a place where people are going to enjoy the surroundings safely. Somewhere that's a former volcano that's now a tourist destination. The really clever people in the room, the ones that come from posh families, the ones that have been there on holiday, will say, that is Yellowstone National Park. I'm telling you I'm right. And you would be. When you say, yes, it is Yellowstone National Park, those same people go, told you I was the cleverest in the room. The interesting thing is, you ask that question of a room full of children under 5, and you can only imagine the kind of extraordinary responses you get. My favorite is this. It's the face of an evil wizard. I know I'm looking at you now, and some of you are going, no, I can't. Doesn't matter. It's not the right answer. Right? But then you take it on a stage, you see. So then you turn round to this room of business leaders and you say, could you come up with a story in 1 minute? 1 minute. Could you come up with a story to tell based on that picture? And what you do with that business group is you say, I'm going to put you into groups of 5. And then when the time's up, I'm going to ask one person from each group to come out and tell us their story. Now, here's the thing with a room full of adults. At the point you say, in a minute, I'm going to choose one of you from the group to come out and tell the room the story, nobody in the group is thinking about the story. Everybody in the room is thinking about, well, I'm not doing it. You're the eldest, you do it. Or, you're the youngest, get up there. And then you say, right, who's got a story? And the groups go, sorry, we haven't even decided who's telling the story yet, right? You do it with a room full of kids under 5, and they are wetting themselves. Every hand in the room goes, me! Pick me! And then they fight, right? But my favorite explanation to this, you can tell I'm getting excited, can't you? Don't kids excite you the way they see the world? So these kids stood there and they said, we've got a story, less than 1 minute, actually 45 seconds. We've got a story. And they came up and this kid went, here's the story. Follow me. This is true. They said there is an evil wizard in this story. They'd remembered that bit, right? There's an evil wizard in the story, but you can't see the evil wizard. The evil wizard's off the top corner of the screen. But the evil wizard is sucking all of the color out of the earth. And the people on the bridge are brave soldiers. And it's their job to stop the world becoming black and white. Whoa. Like, wow, right? I know, unbelievable, okay? Here's the thing. Do you know what we ought to do next time there's ICOT? Get rid of all the adults that are on the stage speaking and let only people under 5 stand up and give lectures. That's what we should do. Here's another one very quickly because I can see you enjoyed that one. That one is date drying in the Cairo Basin. That's the right answer. My favorite answer from a room full of little children. That group of people are building a duvet, a bedspread for a giant. Isn't that lovely, right? So, the question is this. Where does it go? I've got maybe 15 minutes with you, so by way of trying to explain it a little bit further, I'm going to tell you about another big friend of mine. Be ready to be impressed, okay? Last time, you didn't give me the response I was expecting. When I dropped in Sebastian's name, what I was expecting was a big ooh from the audience. Didn't happen. When I tell you about this guy, I expect the correct response, okay? For my own self-esteem, you can tell I don't have any. So, I don't know why you're laughing. Okay. So, a couple of years ago, I got the opportunity, because I know nothing. Honestly, I learn everything I learn from the people I meet. They amaze me. People amaze me. Anyway, a couple of years ago, I was invited to give a speech in Saudi Arabia. It was an interesting and quite complex ask, actually, because they asked me to give a speech about empowerment at a conference on the theme of empowerment. Okay, this was, you can imagine. And actually, there was a point where I thought, do I go? And I'm afraid I'm a little bit superficial because I wasn't going to go until they told me who the other keynote speaker was. When they told me who the other keynote speaker was, I was on the plane. I don't care about my moral responsibility. I'm going to meet this hero of mine, right? Now, before I went, you know how when you get to meet somebody who you've idolized and admired and respected for many years, you get quite nervous, right? And for about 2 weeks before I left to go to this event, I was really nervous. And so I started practicing all kinds of things. I'm a bit stupid this way, right? So I even thought to myself, myself, how do you say hello to a hero? Right? So I'm thinking, do I just casually go up to him? Because apparently the deal was I would get 5 minutes with him in a private room between our speeches, right? I was going to speak, 5 minutes, he was going to speak. So I'm practicing my hello. Is it a hi? You know, do you want to act like you hang with people like this all the time? Yo, my bro. What do you do? Do you curtsy? Hello, your worship, your honor. May I look at you now? So I'm practicing that, and then the big important thing, right? I know I'm going to have 5 minutes with this man in a room on my own. Now, this is a guy who has changed the world. So I'm thinking to myself, I have 5 minutes. I have 5 minutes to ask one question to get a response from a man who's changed the world. So then I'm practicing the question, right? I'm even practicing on my 15-year-old son who's going, Dad, I'm on my Xbox, go away. Right? And I'm rehearsing the question. So then I fly to Saudi Arabia and I'm ready. I've got my hello just right. Not too casual, not too formal. Hello, it's lovely to meet you. Honestly, it's an honor. I'm ready. And I've got the question that will rock my world, okay? So the moment arrives. I do my speech, it goes okay, but obviously nobody's really listening to me because they're waiting for him. You know, like when you go to a rock concert and there's like a support act before the main act? That was me down here. It went okay, but everyone was eating popcorn waiting for the main act, right? So I come off stage feeling okay. And then it hits me, you know, the kind of adrenaline of the speech is dying down and I'm being taken to the room where my hero is, right? And I'm thinking as I'm walking along, remember the hello, remember the question, remember the hello. I get to the door, okay? And everything's cool until I open it. Now, when I open the door and my hero is stood in front of me, I go to pieces. I become a gibbering wreck, right? There in front of me is Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple, right? So I'm stood there going, yeah, it's you! You! Ah! Right? So I'm thinking to myself, I blew the hello. Remember the question. I'm on the question in my head, right? Remember the question. He's great. He's obviously used to this. So he says, hi, I'm Steve. I know who you are. I couldn't remember, right? So then the question's gone. Everything has gone. Nothing happens. And all that comes out of my mouth, the moment I have with a man who has changed the world, all that comes out of my mouth is, can I have a selfie? Now, I wouldn't care, really. But as we're stood there and he's charming and he's ready for the selfie and he's smiling, I look at my phone and realize that it's a bloody Samsung. Luckily, this is true, I got a second chance, and this is a miracle, right? Because despite all of that, I'll show you the photo later. Despite all of that, I found myself sat next to him on the flight back from Riyadh to London. Would you believe it? Genuinely. That day, God was smiling at me, right? I'm sat there next to Voz. I am so excited. He's not. He's thinking, How did the lunatic end up next to me? But I've calmed myself down now, right? I've had a couple of whiskeys in the bar before I get on the plane. I'm quite chilled. Anyway, we get talking. He's an amazing man, very shy. A few things I want you to know about him. I'm going to finish with this, and then I'm going to leave you, right? First thing you need to know about Steve is he will tell you that when he was a child, he describes himself this way. So when I was a kid, about 8 or 9 years of age, he said, I was one of those children who many people would describe as socially dysfunctional. Just remember the next time you're looking at that awkward kid in your class. That could be Steve Wozniak, right? Socially dysfunctional. He said, I was one of those kids that I just didn't know how to play with other children. Whenever I tried to play with other kids, it just got into a mess. I'd end up in a fight or an argument, not because I was aggressive or nasty. I just didn't know. He said, and it was interesting because I remember that's when it all began for me, Richard. I used to look out of the classroom window and think to myself, when I grow up, I'd love to be able to make the world better for people like me. That's where it began for him. He said, and it was an amazing journey. He said, but right back then, he said, I had two options based on the experiences I'd had in my life. He said, one was to be an engineer. He said, my dad was an engineer, and engineers change the world. He said, the other was to be a teacher. He said, because the teacher I had in that grade at school, she was amazing. She was the one human being who, when I was in her company, she used to make me feel like I was clever, like I could speak, like I was funny, like I was a proper human being. There's the power of teaching. Because if that woman hadn't taught Steve in that year, who knew what might have happened? Because it might not be what this is. He said, anyway, as I grew up, I went into engineering, got fascinated by new technology, digital technology, and the rest is history. He said, what a lot of people don't know about me is that I left Apple in 1987, and when I left Apple in 1987, he said, I was very lucky because I never had to work another day in my life. He said I could pretty much choose what I wanted to do already with the rest of my life. And he said, as I was thinking about it, he said, I remembered that day in the classroom, and he said, I'd fulfilled my first ambition. I'd become an engineer. I'd done stuff that really made a difference to people. He said, so I decided it was probably time to fulfill my second ambition. So he said, I became a teacher. So the world doesn't know that, most people. He said, I became a teacher in a local secondary school teaching 7th grade technology. Fab, right? So he has some interesting views on education. Let me quickly share two. One and then a challenge. So the first thing he said to me was, I'll tell you what I think, Richard. And he said, I know it's a big argument. He said, the world, when they talk about education, seems to be obsessed with curriculum. The world seems to be obsessed with what you should teach kids. He said, let me tell you, from my perspective, that's almost irrelevant. He said, but how people learn, he said, that's the master stroke. Completely different from E.D. Hirsch. And frankly, which one am I going to believe? Because Steve Wozniak's changed the world. So then I said to him, well, where does that come from? He said, well, I'll tell you, it actually comes from a deep place. From when we started Apple. He said, Steve and I set it up. It moved really fast. Jobs was incredible, unbelievable entrepreneur, just made stuff happen. He said, but what that meant was people started throwing money at us incredibly fast. And we were making promises that with the staffing level we had, we couldn't keep. So that meant we had to employ people quickly. He said, and one night the two of us went out for a beer to talk about this because it scared us. Because frankly, we were both college dropouts. We'd never employed or managed ourselves, let alone other people. So we went out for a beer and he said, there's a lot of nonsense written about jobs. But on this night, he said something that's become kind of famous. He said to me, you know what was, if we're going to make this work, we can't be a company that makes stuff. Because if we're a company that makes stuff, we'll be dead in 2 years. He said, we have to be a company that constantly questions, challenges, break the rules, and invents stuff. He said, now here's the challenge. Because hiring clever people in Silicon Valley, where they were based, that was easy. The cleverest people on earth were heading to Silicon Valley. The finest mathematicians, the finest physicists, the finest computer scientists. They were all heading from all over the world to Silicon Valley. And Stanford University, which at the time was the world's most technologically advanced university, was right at the heart of the valley. Hiring clever people, they said, that was easy. We needed something different. And so that night, they came up with a mantra. It's one of my favorite challenges that I'm going to lay down to you now as I leave the stage. He said, you know what? We came up with a mantra for the kind of people we were going to employ. And he said, you know, it must be right. It must work because Apple still use it today as a core hiring philosophy. He said, and it's this. At Apple, we will never hire anyone who needs managing. Like so many things that Apple create, gloriously simple on the surface, but so complicated underneath, don't you think? So there's my challenge to you as you go through what's left of this convention, as you think back and reflect on what you've seen and heard so far. If we're to get this right globally, if we're to help our children change the world, if we're to make sure they can control change, they can thrive and not just survive in their future, then we have to create an education system that ensures that our children grow to be people who don't need managing. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.